At the end of 2020, China announced the complete eradication of extreme poverty in the country. How did they carry out this ambitious program, and what has followed in the 4 years since? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee, and this is my co-host, KJ No. KJ, why don't you start off with the headlines this week?
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan meets with the Chinese leadership in Beijing. From August 27th to 29, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Central Military Commission Vice Chairman Zhang Yuxia, and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. The Chinese side urged the U.S. to adhere to the 5 agreements of the Bali and San Francisco summits: not to initiate a hot war, not to wage a cold war, not to undermine China's system or obstruct its development, and not to interfere in Taiwan province. Chinese readouts show the U.S. agreeing to commit to this, but U.S. readouts make no mention of these understandings. The U.S. claimed that it was seeking to manage the relationship responsibly with China, but proceeded and followed the meeting with hostile sanctions against China, as well as meeting with top secessionist officials of Taiwan province as part of a well-established good cop, bad cop routine.
China's life expectancy is on the rise. A report released last week by China's National Health Commission has confirmed that the country's average life expectancy has now risen to a record 78.6 years. Along with that, other good news: maternal mortality rate has dropped, while healthcare resources have steadily increased. Medical services have also seen significant improvement, with a total of over 9 billion consultations recorded, an increase of over 1 billion from the previous year.
Chinese-American neurology and cancer researcher Jane Wu commits suicide after being hounded for researching while Chinese. Jane Bingrun Wu, a renowned Chinese-American researcher in molecular biology and neurodegenerative diseases, was recently found dead from suicide. She had had her research funding cut off, her lab shut down, and according to sources, was being hounded by the National Institute for Health and Northwestern University for researching while Chinese. That is to say, collaborating with Chinese universities on basic medical research and teaching. Wu is not the only Chinese researcher to commit suicide. Su Chengzang, the prodigy Chinese physicist, also committed suicide at the start of the China Initiative. Wu's area of expertise was basic molecular research exploring novel approaches for neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's, ALS, dementia, an area with no military defense or security implications. At least 112 Chinese-born scientists have lost their jobs, and hundreds of Chinese scholars have been hounded by the NIH. U.S. legislators have said that Chinese are welcome to study the humanities in the U.S., but not the sciences.
According to an independent study conducted by Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, Chinese leaders approved loans worth $4.61 billion to Africa last year, the highest amount since 2019. As part of its Belt and Road Initiative, China granted Africa over $10 billion in loans a year between 2012 and 2018, but lending dropped after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. This new report comes out just as Beijing is set to host African leaders at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation this week.
Tunnel warfare pioneered by China keeps the Palestinian struggle alive. According to scholars interviewed by the Palestine Chronicle, the Palestinians and other resistance factions learned from and were inspired by the tactical and strategic successes of China in Vietnam in their anti-imperialist decolonial struggles. In particular, the construction and use of tunnels for military purposes has been critical in sustaining armed people's war, as recent videos from Hezbollah and Ansar Allah have shown. One example of effective tunnel warfare occurred during the Korean War, when the US military attempted to take a small hill with 2 battalions over 5 days. It ultimately cost the US 60,000 troops and 25,000 casualties over 42 days of intense combat before the US retreated in defeat. The hill, Shangangling or Triangle Hill, had 9 kilometers of dug in tunnels. Hong Kong Stand News editors found guilty of sedition. The editors of the Hong Kong Stand News have been found guilty of sedition. The Stand News was, along with Hong Kong Free Press and Apple Daily, one of the key platforms for spreading anti China hatred and encouraging violence against the authorities during the violent US backed protests of 2019. Hong Kong Stand News was a key vector of incitement and provocation, in particular working as the media arm of the US backed rioters, most notably during the Yanlong incident, where rioters traveled 30 kilometers into the suburbs to instigate violence against pro Chinese communities. The Hong Kong Stand News was co founded in 2014 by Evan Fowler, a member of the Henry Jackson Society. Journalist Laura Ruggieri described the Hong Kong Stand News as an influence operation disguised as a media project, conceived and funded by foreign forces that attempted a color revolution in Hong Kong.
In 2013, Xi Jinping announced an ambitious targeted poverty alleviation program aimed at eradicating what they called extreme poverty in China. Extreme poverty defined by the World Bank as living under $1.90 a day. And over the course of 8 years, this program did exactly that, dispatching over 3 million Communist Party cadre to rural areas, conducting surveys, bringing internet to villagers, building roads, and working alongside poor peasants, local officials, and volunteers until each household was lifted out of poverty. After nearly 8 years of this ambitious program, in December of 2020, Xi announced the final remaining 100 million people had been lifted out of extreme poverty, securing what he called a complete victory in this war against poverty. To discuss this program and what came in the 4 years since, we have a very special guest, Tings Chak. Tings is a researcher and art director at Tricontinental Institute and editor of Dangsheng News, and she led the Tricontinental study on China's Targeted Poverty Alleviation program, which was called Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China. Tings, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, and congratulations on this amazing new show.
Well, it's great to have you. And there's a lot to talk about. Maybe to start, you wrote this paper in 2021 on China's TPA program. And you said in this paper, and I think it's a really good place to start, China's TPA program can be summarized by one slogan: one income, two assurances, and three guarantees. So, can you explain what this means in more detail?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for anyone who follows a little bit of Chinese policy or how the Chinese government works, you'll encounter a lot of slogans with numbers. It's usually one this, two that, three that. And so that's part of the Chinese socialist tradition, how to popularize and explain government policy. But one of the things I think you already mentioned in your introduction is that, obviously there's an international standard of how extreme poverty is actually measured, and there is a poverty line that's set at $1.90 according to the World Bank. But one of the things is that we know that poverty isn't just about income. It's not just about cash handouts to be able to maybe have some stopgap measures to alleviate some of the difficulties of living under poverty, but they have to address these structural factors. What causes intergenerational poverty? Questions like education, healthcare, and social, environmental factors, and what we could call multidimensional factors. So for China, we have the one income. In fact, China used the income that was higher than what the World Bank used when you actually adjust it to local purchasing terms. And on average, anyone who participated in the program was few times higher than the World Bank average. But other aspects are actually more interesting and probably more important in some ways to address intergeneration poverty. Two assurances. is looking at food and clothing. The fact that you don't actually have to worry about food and clothing; those are guaranteed. And the three guarantees are basic medical services, so ensuring that you have access to basic medical services in the countryside, that you have housing, and how housing was defined was that it has to be safe enough to live in, obviously, but also have running water. You know, we're talking about potable water, drinking water, as well as electricity, which are really essential when you're talking about a vast country with a large rural population. And then finally, it's the aspect of free and compulsory education, which in China it's 9 years. So as you mentioned, it was under, this metrics, this more multi-dimensional metrics, that China was able to announce the eradication of extreme poverty at the end of 2020, which was, as we look back now 4 years ago, still really when COVID was, hitting China quite hard and just beginning to spread around the world. So it was a quite important feat and an important conjuncture. And I would just add that this was the last 100 million people that had exited extreme poverty in China. That, in a total of almost 800 million people that exited poverty in the last 40 years. If and that accounts for something like 75% of the world's poverty reduction. So it's a huge contribution to humanity, not just for China.
It does take quite a bit of sacrifice and commitment on the part of CPC members. And I think a lot of people would be really interested to like learn a little bit more about like the details of how this campaign was actually conducted. As you noted in your report, the CPC members are expected to live in these villages and these really humble conditions for very long stretches of time, for years at a time, and in very remote areas where they may not see their family or and friends for years. And you noted in the report that I think something like 1,800 CPC members died as a result of these like really harsh conditions that they were living in. And so, can you talk a little bit about that? And can you speak, more on the process of identifying, out of a country of like 1.4 billion people, how do they identify these people? How do they address each village or each household's really particular needs? And maybe can you speak on some of the challenges they faced and, how these challenges were addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think in preparing for that study, I had a chance to go to Guizhou province, which is in the southwest of China and one of the poorest regions historically in China, to actually get to talk to some of the people who went to the countryside, spent years living and working amongst peasants, people, women, youth in the rural areas. And you start to understand how challenging it is and also how vast a country China is. I mean, you have this metrics, we just talked about. So it's great, but it's still in the abstract. How do you actually identify and understand who the poor are that fit under, this campaign in such a vast country? So the first year in 2014, there are 800,000 party members that were actually sent to just identify, spend time. This is for anyone who's been, done any kind of social movement work or has been a grassroots organizer. It's literally going down to the grassroots and doing that. That means knocking on people's doors. And we're talking about knocking on people's doors in 128,000 villages across the country. These are the poorest villages around in the most remote areas. And in that first round, there were 90 million poor people and over 30 million households that were identified to fit under that program. And then there was also another series, of people that were sent to verify, to check out the housing of everyone. What were the education levels of everyone in that family? What were the health conditions? A very thorough assessment of people's lives to basically be able to identify people who are considered poverty stricken. And I actually like that word in terms of poverty stricken because it's not something about being poor as a kind of an essential part of someone's being. It's because there's structural factors that make someone poor or impoverished or poverty stricken. And so, as you mentioned, I mean, that's just the first round of just identifying. And then the years that followed meant sending millions, 3 million party cadre to go and actually do the real heavy work of living, working, and figuring out a plan so that each family, each individual exits poverty. That's an individualized plan. So one person I had a chance to spend time with is Secretary Liu, and I got to actually go with him around his just daily life. What did it look like, you know? So he was one of in this village called Danyang. He was one of 52 cadre that were sent to village, a very small one, about 3,000 people, and he was personally responsible for 5 households, and that's what he spent those few years. At that point, he had been there for about 3 years. It's, being on your WeChat or your cell phone every day, responding to whatever it is that comes up. Someone's kid doesn't go to school, someone is sick, resolving the needs of the people in their daily lives. But he also said lots of things that are really challenging, is that, how do you earn trust? Most of these people who are sent aren't from the actual, village. There's all sorts of reasons why, because, try to avoid certain kinds of nepotism, or, you might give your own family some particular benefits, or some, micro to larger scales of corruption. So people are actually sent to villages where they don't live and might not even speak the local dialect. And so there's a huge process of how do you earn trust to be able to explain what the government is trying to do, but also be there, and basically, yeah, just get the trust so that people want to participate in this program. And so it's a lot of that daily resolving of people's problems, being on call. And I think one of the things that's really important to stress in people like Secretary Liu is that this is a very different model than what you see in a lot of global south countries, which is based on sort of international aid or NGOs, oftentimes international NGOs that are kind of like parachuted into community. Here, it's really about mobilizing the citizens, mobilizing first and foremost the party members in the leadership role, and that's a process that's been learned through many decades of socialist construction, dating back to, the Mao Zedong years of how to organize mass scale nationwide campaigns. And I guess we won't might have time to go into it, but I had a chance to also meet with, different people like teachers or um, doctors, students, university professors, amongst the millions of other people who are actually sent to contribute in their own ways to this massive nationwide poverty alleviation campaign.
So, one of the Western media critiques that I often see of the TPA is that they're like, despite this really ambitious program, there are still hundreds of millions of people in China continuing to struggle with low incomes and poor standards. Um, so, I guess I was wondering if, in the 4 years since, is the government planning to address things like that? Because that's often the most common critique that I've seen in Western media. And the end of the program was announced in December of 2020. And can you talk a little bit about, what has happened in the 4 years since, what has been the follow up? Are they, trying to eliminate, less extreme forms of poverty, I guess you could call it?
Yeah, I think of course. I mean, I think it's a good reminder. I mean, I grew up, I mean, I'm originally from Hong Kong, and I grew up going always to the rural villages where my grandparents were from, and really got to see, even though it wasn't part of the, poverty alleviation, this phase of the campaign to struggle against poverty, you really do see the dramatic shifts in the life um, of the people. But you also have to remember the starting point was really low. Like China, when we say it's a developing country, it really is a developing country. People might see sort of the high-speed railways. They might compare with, oh, is Shanghai, something like a New York or Beijing? There's a lot of imagination about the big capitals. But I think when you look at the countryside, you really realize that, okay, 70 something years ago when the revolution happened, it makes sense that China was actually the 12th poorest country in the world when you look at, GDP per capita. It's a very poor country, and the starting point was very low. So yes, of course, eliminating the extreme forms was still a necessary phase. Now there's other aspects around relative poverty, but I think one of the most important things is still focus on the countryside, which is what now it's in the phase of the rural revitalization. And actually had a chance just 2 months ago to go back to Guizhou, to this time another county. I was accompanying a professor who was bringing some students out, and I had a chance to go to Rongjiang, which is one of the last nine counties that were exited extreme poverty. And it's the same province that I went to, 3.5 years ago. And this time it was interesting to see exactly that. What does this rural revitalization, which before that seemed a bit abstract to me, how do you kind of continue and maintain um, uh, the important gains that were made under the TPA program, but in a different phase? Because the TPA program was really this, as I mentioned, this campaign style approach, mobilizing nations' resources, huge amount of human and material and financial resources, um, from the central levels of government all the way down to the grassroots. This huge, something like 250 billion dollars that were spent during those 8 years. I talked about the people who were mobilized. It's huge infrastructure that was built, but that's not something you sustain on a long track. You have to maintain that level and make sure that people are not falling back into poverty. So this now in this Rongjiang community is really fascinating, actually. And one of the things is that they've been developing, based on already a local tradition of using soccer as really a big way to mobilize different kinds of resources in this community. So what is it's called Chunchao, which is translated as the Village Super League. It's like basically a peasant-run soccer league, as long tradition in the region, but they've incorporate that into how to maintain, um, to encourage, to basically and ensure that there's continued investment, partly through tourism, partly through supporting of local artisanal, production, agricultural production, but linked to the sort of innovative use of soccer in the region. So I had a chance to see one of their championships, where they bring together these peasant football teams around the regions. They're supported by their villages, and if you have like a halftime show, instead of, I don't know, maybe the contemporary pop singers, you have a lot of traditional dance, local food. At one point, I was in a karaoke with about 10,000 people. You have women showing off the local agricultural goods, like walking, like they have these parades where you're bringing like the local lamb and you get to try them, but it's like a lot to do with how do you um, really uplift peasant and local culture in a way that also brings in, people from the cities, people who are watching online, because of course, creating the infrastructure like 5G network that was really part of TPA allows for people now to connect, if you're an agriculture producer, from the rural areas to the urban markets, which is essential for maintaining livelihood. But also brings in other aspects of, I met a lot of youth that had studied, at the top universities in Beijing or elsewhere, that are having a chance to now go back to their hometowns because now there's, a lot of infrastructure that is built, but there's also this, how they bring back that knowledge to say, oh, now we want to live stream and, show off, what some of the, local there, they have a lot of tie dye tradition, with indigo dye. How do we kind of incentivize this in our local communities, like the grandmas that have handed this down for a long time and can make a little bit of extra income? So all of that is mixed together now in this period of rural revitalization, where it has to really, let's say, incentivize the local communities to find innovative ways based on the infrastructure that has already been built that allows for that next step of sustaining the gains made, but also advancing to eliminate other forms of less severe poverty, as you mentioned. There's a lot there, but I really was quite touched by the fact of, now on a lot of Chinese social media, um, it's not just about selling products, it's also about this pride of being from the countryside, because for so long, films, TV series, all this media was saying the only way you can sort of make it or have a better life is if you leave the countryside and go to the city. That's how you can be modernized or have a modern life. But now there's all this ways of, technology also going to the countryside to say, yeah, you can live in the countryside. You can, it's not, having a modern life is not at odds with tradition. in many ways, you know? And so this is kind of this aspect of rural revitalization, which is quite fascinating. We'll have to, keep accompanying it over the next years.
Yeah.
Tings,
Oh, go ahead.
yes, Tings, can you say a little bit more about this concept of common prosperity? Because I think that's one of the things that distinguishes China's approach from what we do in the West or in other countries, which on the surface might have some surface similarities. But I think the foundational difference is really this notion of common prosperity.
No, I think it's an important one because I think to understand, like we started with the slogans, to understand Chinese policy, sometimes it feels like there's a lot of terminology that is hard to interpret. It sounds almost fanciful when you translate to English, but it sounds quite all right in Chinese. But I think one of the things with common prosperity is there's Confucius roots to it, but then there's also the communist interpretation of these Confucius traditions, which we might not have a chance to get into now. But one of the essential things is I'll actually talk about a quote that I think a lot of people hear in the West, which is from Deng Xiaoping, which of course is the president that really spearheaded this opening up reform. And people like to say, "Oh, he said let a few get rich first, or just let a few people get rich." I think maybe not even the first part. And in many ways, it was a or interpretation that, okay, of course, then China has gone down the capitalist path and abandoned socialism because it's all about making money. Chinese people care about money. I think like everyone cares about money. We still live in a capitalist world. But the fact is, what's often forgotten, and I think very intentionally left out, is that's not what Deng Xiaoping said. Deng Xiaoping said is, yes, let a few get rich first, and so that they can lift up the rest. Because there is a responsibility that those who get rich first, or in some regions that get rich first, in some ways, what we mean by getting, maybe developed more quickly, um, have this responsibility to bring others along toward this goal of common prosperity. It's not enough for yourself to get rich. There is a sense of redistribution and social responsibility. In some ways, all this huge effort of poverty alleviation and now rural revitalization is that. We had 40 years of opening and reform. I'm seeing images now of Shanghai. I'm actually in Shanghai now, so it's not far from out my window. So you'll have all that. The eastern regions, the coastal regions were in a way allowed through state planning to develop first. Of course, we have the famous special economic zones like in Shenzhen, a lot of socialist experimentation of how to incorporate private capital and foreign investment back in under, of course, a government that's led by the CPC. So there's always, constraint mechanisms, very unique, I guess, in China's system. But these regions have a responsibility to now um, in a way give back. So in when I went to Guizhou 3 years ago till now, there's a lot of pairing that happens between these eastern regions, whether it could be at a university level, it could be at city to city level, it could be at the governance level, all kinds of levels where there's a direct transfer of knowledge, technology, resources, know-how to help uplift the poor, underdeveloped regions, and that has always been part of the strategy. But China was too poor to just say, oh, and too big to just say you will just develop a country of, hundreds of millions of people in one fell swoop. There's no one size fits all. And the country is so diverse, you have to experiment, do pilot testing in different regions, and then see how this will work in a different region. And we're still in that socialist experimentation and construction process
So
and
there was
towards
a
social, common prosperity.
so there was a very deliberate process of testing, doing trial spots, and then scaling up and expanding as well. I'm also hearing that there was a very deliberate scientific approach to the poverty alleviation.
Absolutely. That's why I think it's this a concept of targeted poverty alleviation. The targeted part is actually really key because there's a recognition that you can't, as Xi Jinping used the quote, you can't use a grenade to blast a flea.
Mm.
It's kind of funny, but you can't use a one size fits all mechanism and think that you're going to resolve the question of a person's life, in diverse areas of such a large country.
Mm. Well, this is certainly no small feat. As you mentioned earlier, since the 1950s, I think China has lifted 850 million people out of poverty, and that represents, 70% of the world's poor. And you said in, other places as well that that's all of Latin America, the Caribbean, and most of the US combined. And you touched upon it a little bit a couple minutes ago with Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up period, but I was hoping maybe you could situate the TPA program historically within China's process of socialist modernization, and maybe like what people get wrong about socialist modernization, like people in the West particularly.
Yeah, I think this is one thing we explored a lot. One of the collaborations we've been doing with Tricontinental is with a journal in China called 文化纵横, which is a left progressive journal. And what we've been trying to do is translate some of the articles by Chinese thinkers to kind of enter in a dialogue with people in the West, but also primarily in the global South, because there's a lot of oftentimes confusions and I think also intentionally seeded confusions around China because there's not enough voices actually coming from China on that. So we had one issue specifically on this, where to understand poverty alleviation as a stepping stone on this path to socialist modernization. And I think it's important why socialists in front of modernization. It's not just like a buzzword because modernization up until now, especially since the post-war era, has been very much dominated by a Western understanding. There, and it's not even just a post-war moment. I think it's actually the rise of the West has been a history of, we know it well, colonization, genocide, imperialism. That continues till today. There has been one Western um, dominated sense of modernization. But for the global South, and especially for socialist oriented projects, is there another way to modernize that isn't treading that same path? Is there a way to do that? And I think in many ways, China is setting an example to think about that future. It's not there yet. It's very much in this process of experimentation and construction. But of course, quoting Deng as well, he said, socialism isn't poverty. Poverty is not socialism, so there has to be addressing the question of poverty is a key aspect. But I want to just stress that it's not just, yes, Xi Jinping, of course, innovated with the poverty alleviation campaign. It's, I think, many things that rest of the world can learn from this experience. Um, but it's something that the communists have been um, uh, concerned about and dealing with since basically its foundation of the party 100 years ago. And this dates back when you look at, the first revolutionary base areas, specifically looking in Beijing and Jiangxi in the 1930s, even before the PRC was established. It was already understanding that in order to build a mass-based party amongst the working and peasant classes, you have to address the questions of poverty, the material concerns of the people, or you won't ever build a mass-based party. So there were already many different campaigns around land reform policies before PRC was founded in these base areas to recognize these questions. So then, of course, with the Mao era, we have basic industrialization, we have nationwide um, uh, uh, land reform that was taken, huge gains were made, life expectancy doubled. All of that was also addressing key questions of poverty. So we can see in different phases, there have been different strategies to address the core question of poverty and people's livelihoods. So in a way, the history of Chinese communism is a history of addressing the essential, root causes of poverty, hunger, and, improving the lives of people.
Tings, one of the things that I think is still hard for the West to wrap its mind around is that China has actually ended extreme poverty. Now, I grew up in an extraordinarily poor country, South Korea, when it was developing. It was probably poorer than China at the time. And it's also a model of how not to modernize because you still have that kind of extreme poverty along with that extreme wealth. And you still have, homelessness and beggars, etc. But when you tell people in the United States that China doesn't have homelessness, or that it's almost non existent, or that it doesn't have beggars, they'll point you to, some silly YouTube video which shows, Chinese people with begging bowls, which is absurd because it's a cashless society. Even if you were begging, you would not be using a bowl. But so how would you go about convincing people that this is real, short of actually visiting China? I mean, I think the mechanisms you describe are very, very important, and it kind of touches the heart of what is effective. In particular, that you don't turn poverty into an individual pathology, and that you don't try and treat the poverty as something that an individual has to, become more capitalist in order to overcome, and then abandon their, kin and kith, and feel this kind of, survivor guilt. So there's some very, very powerful mechanisms that you've mapped out for us. But on the kind of fundamental question for people who disbelieve this, is there anything that you would say to them?
Short of visiting, I mean, I really think because it's interesting. Over the years here, especially since COVID was lifted, and a lot of people are coming to visit and curious to see China firsthand. It's almost one of the first three questions that people always ask. And I've heard all of the wild stories too. Maybe that there's some even an underground city where all the homeless people are kept. There's I don't know, something like that. But I think one of the things actually we did publish maybe I think last year in Dongsheng was a explainer article, and I think we did a video too. Now I'm forgetting. Basically, why is it that China hasn't developed slums in the way that a lot of global South countries have? That also
Mm,
address that question. And I think there's lots of questions on how migration was also, I think, in different ways controlled over different periods, especially when you're looking at this, especially the opening up reform period where we had large migrations from the countryside to the city. And until today, it's a big challenge for migrant workers in the cities. But there, for a country of this size, um, and also comparing with the rest of the global south countries, how do you ensure um, that people do not live in the most abject conditions because of just migration to cities that cannot sustain infinitely a growth? One of the things we're seeing now is that obviously, generally, there's still a large amount of inequality in China. That's no
mm,
doubt. We have not reached common prosperity. But one of the things is that economic floor has been lifted for the vast majority of the people. This is, why 800 million people exit extreme poverty. Now there's a, so-called middle class or middle income group of 300 million people. Never has happened before in the history of humanity. So overall, yes, the economic floor has been lifted, and now these last few 10 years specifically focusing on the forest regions. What you're also seeing is that, so that's one of the reasons also there have been, structural mechanisms to ensure and to address the questions of poverty. So that's why you're also not seeing people living on the streets that you might have seen in 20 years ago. When I visited Beijing 20 years ago, you would see that. And that's not the thing where I live now, you would not see. So there's those economic aspects. But there's also other aspects of adjusting policies as things shift. So one of the things that China is doing now, the hukou system is this registration system of where you were born and having some limitations around what kinds of benefits you might if you migrate to another city to work. So China has now in the recent years been flexibilizing, or I don't know if that's a word, but making more flexible
mm,
some of these policies in lower tiered cities because that's one of the recognitions that big cities, what we're called tier one cities like Beijing or Shanghai, have a kind of capacity that it's reached. That yes, we understand people want to live in cities, but maybe you don't want to live in a city of 20 million. Maybe you want to live in a city just of 10 million or 5 million. So these are some of the things that are being adjusted to recognize that yes, we need to make that a little bit less rigid. But how do you do that without then creating massive slums, which can easily happen in a country so big with such huge flux of people. Anyways, I rambled on a little bit, but there's many mechanisms. But first and foremost, people need to come to China and just see for themselves. I think that's the first and best thing to do. You can also read our Dongsheng Explains.
Yeah, definitely. Tings, it's a pleasure. I know it's really late in Shanghai right now and you have to get up early. So thank you for joining us on the China Report. And, we hope to have you again on soon.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Tings, if you're still
All right.
on.
Sorry, I really rambled. I'm
No, it
like,
was
I crossed the
It's
good.
hour, I
great.
think.
No, it
I'm
was
my
All of
great.
bad.
it. We could have gone
Yeah.
on
What am
forever.
I saying now? I don't even remember. All right. It was really a pleasure. I hope like you can feel free to invite me on anytime. And, I'm happy to talk about other things because sometimes I'm like, I feel like I've become the poverty girl to poverty alleviation.
Definitely.
But it's
Yeah, we'll have you
important
on for
because
other things. Yes. Yes. And it's not just poverty,
so
it's the entire structure that we're really looking at.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I just went to Guizhou, as I mentioned 2 months ago. I haven't really had a chance to, I want to write something about it because it was really, in some ways, I think it was more impactful an experience than even going 3 years ago to see the first phase, because now I'm realizing the complexities of there's many aspects around governance and that I wasn't able to go into that you really start, okay, this is how it almost feels like, how do I say, it's really entering a different new phase of social construction.
Mhm,
And for a long time, I really thought that, okay, there's a kind of nostalgia around what the countryside was or what the early socialist period was, but it's actually, the countryside is about the future. And that's what I realized, and that's really impactful. It's like I am so urbanized to really, like, I fundamentally think that like the city is about the future. When I went there, no, that can't be. That's impossible for the planet to just think
yeah.
that the future
Yeah.
is in the cities. But how do you attract people back? How do you make all the modern comforts also there? While combining that. So, anyways, it's not all thought out in my head yet, but it was really, really powerful experience.
That's really deep what you just said. So, yeah. Hope you
Yeah,
write it
the
up.
future of the countryside.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and really congratulations on your show. I'm really enjoying it, and it's so necessary. So, yeah, I know it must be really hard to maintain the rhythm of a weekly show. So, great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and
Thank
you should
you.
come back on again. It was great
Definitely.
having you.
Definitely. And
Yeah,
and
I'm
and
glad to
personally,
finally get to meet you sort of properly.
yeah, we've been.
Sorry, I
I've
cut you off.
been, personally very inspired by Dongsheng. So,
Mhm.
we're just kind of trying to build upon the work that you've already done.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we're really happy because, as you might have noticed, we just lost the capacity and time to be able to produce video. And so when I saw this program come, I was like, oh, thank goodness that there's, because I before, like, where are the videos? I'm like, we don't have time. I don't have time to do the videos. So I know how much work it is. So this is great. It's really important.
Mm. All right. Thanks, Tings.
All
Thank
right, take
you.
good care.
Thanks,
Bye.
Have a
thanks.
great day.
Yes.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Okay, and for this week's Red Scare of the Week, well, the new Cold War is a big business, and one of its most unhinged foot soldiers is China watcher Gordon Chang. Chang, if you haven't heard of him, he's been kind of predicting the collapse of China since 2001, I believe. But he has a new book out, which means that he's on a media tour on Fox News and other right wing outlets promoting it. It's called Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Very sensationalist title. And as I said, he's been on like a media tour on Fox News almost every week talking about it. And of course, that's largely predicated upon, this scaremongering over China and over how China is seeking to destroy America, like literally. And I think it's best embodied by these two tweets that John's going to pull up. And the first tweet, if you can't read it, it says, let me pull it up. It says, when it comes to China, we cannot take anything for granted. Its internal problems will become our problems if Xi Jinping believes his only way out is to kill foreigners. There's precedent for that in Chinese history. So I just love that tweet. No explanation whatsoever. China is just going to kill all foreigners. Then 20 minutes later, the second tweet, pray, the demons are coming at us hard and our backs are against the wall. There can be no compromise, accommodation, or retreat. Fight. So very sensationalist tweets to, I assume, to promote his book about how China is going to destroy America. And, if that weren't enough, we're going to show this video. We're going to end on this video. And basically, it's Gordon Chang talking about how, the CPC is using the TikTok algorithm to sway the election for Kamala Harris, again, to destroy America. But that's this week's China Report, and we'll see you next week.
And by the way, Jake Sullivan, who was just wrapping up his 3-day trip to Beijing, said that he was touting Kamala Harris's China policies if she were to be elected. And so really what I think was going on was essentially that we heard the National Security Advisor courting the CCP vote. One other thing. We know that in 2020, that China was voting for, first of all, Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primaries. And then it was certainly doing everything it could to get Joe Biden elected as president. That's what happened in 2020. Right now, we don't have very much indication of what the Chinese regime is doing, except, and this is important, on TikTok, the videos are very much anti-Trump, which is an indication that China is using the curation algorithm to support Kamala Harris.
Wow.